Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So I'm really excited today because this is going to be another collaboration video with my friend Blackacre Doe. I will have his channel and info linked down below, but we did a video back in July, or we did like a buddy read of Tim Meyer's Malignant Summer, and we had so much fun collaborating on that we were like, we need to do some more. So this time we chose more of a classic horror release instead of a newer horror release. So today we're going to be talking about The Long Walk by Stephen King. But I don't think I can talk about The Long Walk without talking about Richard Bachman. So for those of you guys who do not know, Richard Bachman is actually the original writer of The Long Walk. So when this first came out in, I believe it was 1979, you did not see The Long Walk by Stephen King on shelves. Not at all. It was The Long Walk by Richard Bachman. Several years later, it would come out that Richard Bachman was the pen name for Stephen King, but a lot of people didn't know that for years. So I figured this would be a really cool time to talk about who Richard Bachman is, why he existed, how he came to be, and what books he has released. So let's start off with this book. So this is probably the rarest thing I own in my Stephen King collection. I do have one book that is signed by both Stephen King and Joe Hill that I'm very proud of, but this is probably the rarest book that I own in my collection. This is the original Bachman Books collection. I believe this came out originally in 1986. This is a hardcover. I did own a soft cover of this as well, but I did give it to a friend of mine who is as big of a Stephen King fan as I am. And apart from some of the original printings of Rage from 1977, this is one of the only ways that you can actually get a copy of Rage, because that book has been out of print since the 90s. Stephen King will never bring it back into print. He's been very vocal on that. And the current Bachman books that you can buy that have been released more recently, so after the 90s, I believe you can get two different collections of Bachman books, do not include Rage. So this is the original release of the Bachman books, and it includes Rage, The Long Walk, Roadwork, and The Running Man, which were the first four novels released by Stephen King's pen name, Richard Bachman. So let's chat about why Stephen King, probably the best-selling author of all time. Actually, I think he's the third best-selling author. I think J.K. Rowling might top him, and there might be one other person. But regardless, definitely the highest-selling horror fiction author, probably one of the most famous authors of all time, definitely one of the authors with the largest bibliographies ever. Pretty much everything he's written has become a New York Times bestseller or adapted to a film or a TV show. All this crazy nonsense. So why would Stephen King, whose very first published novel, Carrie, was pretty much an instant success, need a pen name? And to look at that, we have to actually look back at how publishing houses worked in the 70s. So at the time, Stephen King was working with, I believe it's pronounced Signet, S-I-G-N-E-T, Signet Books, and he really wanted to release two novels in the same year. And the publishing house kind of had this rule that to not oversaturate the market with a certain author, they would only release one novel per author each year, or one novel by an author each year. Which anybody who's a Stephen King fan knows that like Stephen King can easily release two full-length novels in a single year. This year is a great example of that because we got both Later as well as Billy Summers, and he's about to release his third collaboration, or the third part, might be his second collaboration, with Richard Shizmar, which is like the Gwendy storyline. I don't know, I've never read any of the Gwendy books. But he reached out to Signet and he convinced them to release 3 of his novels if he used a pen name. And part of the reason he also wanted to do that was because he wanted to see if his success as an author was because of his talent or because of luck. I think we can all sit and safely say his success as an author is 100% because of his talent, because nobody writes like Stephen King, and Carrie, obviously a huge, almost immediate success when he was still like an unknown author. But to kind of hinder himself to see if it was talent versus luck, he also asked Signet to put like the least amount of marketing possible to his Bachman books. I think his novel Thinner by Richard Bachman only released 28,000 copies before people knew it was Stephen King. And then when it came out a couple years later that it was Stephen King, he released like 10 times as much, like 280,000, or he sold 280,000 editions afterwards. So do with that what you will, but that is a number that I did pull off of Wikipedia. So there's also that. Anyway, so he ended up releasing a couple books that were on the Signet Books publishing label. And the first one that he released was Rage in 1977, which what's interesting about both Rage and The Long Walk is these were both novels that he started writing in 1966. So he wrote Rage, he began writing Rage in 1966, and then rediscovered it as a draft 4 years later and finished it. So it was technically the first novel he ever started that was eventually then completed and then sent off to be published. However, the first novel he fully completed was The Long Walk, which he completed in 1967, but did not get published until 1979. So he was able to release 5 novels as Richard Bachman before people have figured out that he was Stephen King, and that would be Rage, The Long Walk, Road Work, The Running Man, and Thinner. And in 1985, a man named Steve Brown, who was a bookstore worker in DC, started realizing that there was a lot of similarities between the work of Richard Bachman and the work of Stephen King. Did a little digging into like the copyright, I believe, and was able to figure out that it was in fact Stephen King. So Stephen King was kind of publicly outed as being Richard Bachman, 1985-ish, and that kind of ruined the book that he was currently working on to release as Richard Bachman, which is just a lesser known work of Stephen King named Misery. Not sure if you've heard of it. But no, so Misery was actually intended to be a Richard Bachman release because it didn't really focus on like the paranormal and like horror from kind of like an outer force. It was very all like plausible situation, which a lot of his Richard Bachman books tend to lean towards. So it was originally intended to be a Richard Bachman book. Luckily, it was released as a Stephen King book, and today is probably one of the most famous Stephen King novels of all time. I believe it is also the only Stephen King adaptation to have an Oscar. Kathy Bates did win in 1990 for her portrayal of Annie Wilkes in the movie Misery, which is awesome. Misery is one of my top 3 favorite Stephen King books of all time, so very happy that that happened. So to a lot of people, we see The Long Walk now as probably the first Richard Bachman book. As I said earlier, Rage was taken out of publication because there were not 1 but 5 incidences that predated Columbine that cited Rage as an influence to these horrible acts that these disturbed individuals committed against schools. I will let you do your research into that if you feel so inclined. But Stephen King did take Rage out of publication right around the time of Columbine because Rage touches on a lot of things that occurred in Columbine, and he didn't want any more copycats to his novel. I have read Rage. Rage is really, really interesting, and I will do a longer video on the Bachman books as a whole, but we're going to just focus on The Long Walk now. So for all intents and purposes, the first Richard Bachman book that is still in publication and still in print today is The Long Walk. So again, The Long Walk is the first novel that Stephen King ever finished. He wrote it when he was a freshman at the University of Maine between 1966 and 1967. Long Walk is a very interesting story. It is set in a dystopian universe where teenagers, I believe between the ages of, it was either 12 or 14 and 17, so like the cutoff is 18, you can't be 18 to participate, can volunteer to be part of a group of 100 boys who walk from Maine south. That is it. They just walk. But if they ever slow down or stop walking, they will get 3 warnings. After their 3rd warning, they will be shot and killed. But if you outlast the other 99 walkers, you win this grand prize, which is pretty much up to your choosing. It can be anything you want, and I believe a ton of money as well. We follow this story through our main character, Garrity, who I cannot stand. I think Garrity is a very dislikable, misogynistic, homophobic problematic main character, but he's also a teenage boy, and he's also a character who is being written by a teenage boy. So a lot of the flaws that I see in Garrity tend to just be, you know, flaws not only of youth, but also of the time. Again, they are extremely problematic at times, but they are also very, very much things that we would recognize in a common teenage boy. Alongside Garrity, he walks with his friend McVries, or McVries, I'm not sure how to say it, who he meets the morning of the walk and is kind of his best friend during the journey of the walk, along with this kind of like, I've always wanted to use this term, this odd duck named Stebbins, who seems very keyed into himself, very prepared for this walk, but doesn't look like he is physically capable to do this walk, so it is very much for him a mind over matter situation. We then see Ulson, who is our arrogant kind of asshole at the beginning of the book, who the book then uses the walk to quickly break down his character and use him kind of as a character study. And then, of course, the antagonist, or the like sort, not necessarily the villain, but like the guy that you really want to hate while on this journey, you get our character, Barkovich. So the story really does unfold as these main characters walk from Maine south. You get a lot of insight onto this kind of vague dystopian world. A lot of things are more heavily implied than full-on written out for you, which I really, really like. And I have to say that reading a novel that was probably written by an 18-year-old boy, I could not write something like this when I was 18. I will flat out say that. I could not write something like this when I was 18. And the fact that Stephen King is 18 writing this, I mean, this reads like a novel that somebody who's been writing for years has written. Again, there are problems. There's definitely the lens of like immature teenage boy coming through, but there's also a lot of heavy parallels. A lot of parallels of the situation of the long walk seem to be a metaphor for the Vietnam War and for kids who were drafted in the Vietnam War. This is something that Stephen King definitely grew up alongside of, so something that would have been very, very prevalent and he would have been very knowledgeable about at this time. This novel at the root does seem to be a very anti-war novel. So it talks heavily about how these boys pretty much volunteer for this basically suicidal journey with like the far off hope that maybe they win. It's a simple metaphor. You can easily see how the boys are obviously the young drafted soldiers or the young soldiers who volunteered to fight in Vietnam, especially since Vietnam was kind of a war that most people believe we did not need to be a part of as a country. You get a lot of those heavy undertones of this being a pointless mission and these children not needing to sacrifice themselves for something they will most likely never recover from. Before I get into some minor spoilers, I will say that this is one of my least favorite Stephen King books, though I did not dislike it the way that I dislike Cujo and Revival. If you've heard me talk about those, there's a lot of Stephen King books that I'm not a fan of, even though he's my favorite author. And I think for this one, what I didn't necessarily like about this is I couldn't connect with almost any of the characters. I found most of them to be extremely one-dimensional. The ones who had depth were probably Stebbins and Garrity, and to a point McVries. They did kind of open him up a little bit. His storyline, though, does lead back to the kind of like homophobic problems that this book presents, especially through the eyes of Garrity. Again, I'm not saying that that is the mind of Stephen King, but he definitely wrote a very homophobic character, unfortunately, who just unfortunately also happens to be our main character. But I couldn't really connect with any of the characters, and I found the only one that I kind of liked was Stebbins, because Stebbins seemed to be the most self-aware of the problem, whereas the others kind of still felt blinded and jaded with this false hope of getting somewhere and weren't able to fully understand why they were where they were. Whereas Stebbin, once we figure out his motive for being there, everything seems much more clear. He seems very much the only person there with a goal, with an intention, who knows what he is doing. But beyond that, there's not much to this plot. A lot of the reasons that, again, this is a very plot-driven story, even though there are many characters and a lot of stuff does not happen. But when I say plot, I mean the entire reason that you want to read this book is to figure out what's going on and why. I do think that the mystery does get answered at the end, but it is very, it's very much implied. Like I said earlier, Stephen King never comes out and straight up says why anything is happening. You have to really dig deep to figure out what is going on, but you do get your answers from it. This was a 3-star read from me, just because I couldn't stand most of the characters. I did find the ending very bleak, very dark, and very much fitting for the whole story. I know Stephen King has a lot of times where it's like, don't know about this one. But I did actually quite enjoy the ending, and I'm going to talk about the ending here now, so there will be spoilers in this. So stop watching now if you have not. After this, I'm just going to kind of wrap up the video, so I'm going to talk about some spoilers starting now. So I love the idea that Stebbins is the son of the Major, the illegitimate son of the Major, who, as you see throughout the entire thing, is kind of this god on a pedestal to the common people. I know that they talk about the fact that there is no such thing as millionaires anymore, so in this dystopian society, you can see that the Long Walk is probably the only way to get out of a lower class, to elevate yourself. And we can see from Garrity that if you are defiant in your own personal politics, that you will be shut down and taken by what's known as the squads, and seemingly forced to enlist in the squads, even though I imagine that they were probably just murdered. And you do see, though, that the squads have been dehumanized, and you see this over and over and over again as you have these squadron soldiers who are sitting on the trucks that are following our Long Walkers, shooting them without blinking an eye. So we see all of that. But what I think is most interesting is the very, very end scene. I really wanted Stebbins to make it. Stebbins, I feel like Stephen King wanted to paint him as a negative character, but because I found Garrity to be so misogynistic and unlikable, I find Stebbins to actually be the real hero of the story. He's kind of saying like an F you to this dystopian society, to the Major, to his own position, trying to prove that he can get out of it as well. He, again, is the only one who has an actual goal that has nothing to do with the prize. Whereas Garrity, again, seems very unsure. He doesn't really know his place. We don't really understand why a lot of these people chose to join the Long Walk. That seems to be a very consistent theme. And again, that works more as a metaphor to why certain soldiers agree to go to war, especially when it's a war that we don't believe we can win. The fact that Garrity wins, though, I do find slightly problematic, just because I didn't want him to. I didn't think he deserved it. But I do think that that's made up for in what the ending is. So as we see, he wins. Stebbins falls over as Garrity is about to give up. The Major kind of comes to congratulate him, and Garrity does not realize that he has won. He sees a figure walking ahead of him, and he keeps walking, and then eventually runs, and the novel ends. To me, because he is so exhausted and literally on the brink of death when he's talking to Stebbins initially, I do think that when he starts running, he is actually dead. I think the figure that he sees in front of him is death, and I also think it could be McVree's, because Stebbins does say after McVree's dies that their spirits are so close that you could probably still catch up if you died. So I do like the idea that perhaps he is going to be with McVree's in the afterlife. That did become his one friend. Or death, because again, nobody wins in this situation. Even if he lived, he would obviously have PTSD going afterwards. Again, a metaphor for war. And his life would never be the same. Even if he does get the prize and all the riches, he doesn't seem to care about that anymore. He just wants to live and have his life back, which he will never be able to get again. And I think the fact that he doesn't realize he has won really nails that down. But I do think that it is the more fitting, bleak moment to realize that he has died after winning the walk, that it wasn't worth it in the end. And we do get foreshadowing of that when Stebbins talks about watching the two walkers at their final walk, like several years prior. The one walker finally dies, and the other walker just bends over him and cries to him and doesn't even acknowledge that he has won. This is, again, a tale of companionship as well as kind of endurance and being forced to do things that society says that we should, because they have placed us in positions where we can't get out of it. Again, you hear all the time that a lot of people have joined the army because they're not sure what else to do, and we really talk it up as this great grand thing sometimes, and sometimes it's not. Again, this was definitely written at a time where, like, it was very, very anti-war. A lot of people did not want to be involved in the Vietnam War, so I do think that that is definitely what the core of this novel is. Again, not saying people who join the military now are, like, doing anything wrong. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that that was definitely a mindset back in the 60s. So yeah, overall, I think it's a very cool metaphor. I think it's a very interesting dystopia. I would have loved to learn more about it. But I really did not like any of the main characters. I will say Stephen King has gotten far better at writing his main characters and making them pretty likable nowadays. But I do find it really, really interesting that he did write this as a teenager. And I have to shout out Blackacre Doe for pointing that out to me, because I did always think that Rage was the first novel that he ever wrote. Rage is the first novel that he ever started writing. But The Long Walk is the first one that he ever actually completed. And it was, I don't want to take words out of Blackacre's mouth, because I'm going to let him tell you guys all about his opinions on this novel, and he's going to have, I think, more of an in-depth review on the novel as a whole, whereas mine is a little bit of, like, background on Bachman, and I talk about the book. But it was really interesting to have his insight on this story as well. It was we have very similar tastes in books, so it was interesting to see how we had certain characters that we both really, really liked and were really, really rooting for, and neither of them were Garrity. But that also makes me wonder if Stephen King intentionally made Garrity an unlikable character. Which I don't know if he did, but Blackacre said that a lot of these characters reminded him of kind of like the bullies in high school, like back in the day. And I was like, oh my god, a lot of these characters are bullies in high school. So I really wonder if Stephen King took like his high school bullies and put them into like Olsen and Barkovich and kind of gave them like reader's karma, because like honestly they don't have the greatest fates in this novel. And I was like, oh, that's such a brilliant concept. Like I could 100% see a teenage college student absolutely putting his high school bullies into his story and giving them these like awful fates. But it's fiction, guys. Anyways, that is all that I have for you guys today. Again, this is a collaboration buddy read with Blackacre Doe. I will have his video linked either up in the cards or down below, and one of the two, probably both. But yes, as always, I post every Monday and Thursday, sometimes on Saturdays. I think I hit every Saturday this month, though, so Saturdays get a lot of love now. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoy these videos, please hit that like and subscribe button down below, and I will catch you all in the next one. Mwah!